Hello, Gary.
Hey, have you had a nice break?
I have had a nice break. I drove to Portugal in an electric car, so I'm feeling quite green.
And I'm green with envy because I think my carbon footprint's pretty bad right now. Yeah.
Yeah, your carbon heels.
Yeah. But it was nice to take a break, but I've sort of felt weird that there was no new Rockonteurs. And I like this new video thing that's been going on that our producer Ben has organized. You can watch us now, some of the old ones up on YouTube, can't you?
You can, yeah, which a lot of people were asking for.
They're not whole episodes. I don't know, how long are they?
They're 20 minutes, I think.
Right. Yeah. But some good stuff. You get to see inside our boudoirs or our studios anyway. So, but today, our first guest of season 2.
First guest is Ian Anderson. I mean, come on.
I know, Jethro Tull. What did he mean to you as a teenager?
One of the first sort of rock things I saw on TV was Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die. It was in 1977, wasn't it? Some BBC thing, yeah.
Thick as a Brick was big in our house. My brother and we love that. I still love it. I think it's a fantastic record.
It's an incredibly complex record, also with that incredible sleeve. And I often wonder did you ever know the Family Examiner, the website? It's the funniest thing I've ever seen. It was a spoof local paper. And I just wonder if that came from Thick as a Brick.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, there was so much to read. I don't know whether I read it all as a kid. Every detail in it is written by, included the small ads, is written by members of the band, and it's an entire newspaper, isn't it? And of course, Aqualung was massive, and Locomotive Breath. What a track that was!
Yeah.
So, it's with great pleasure that we welcome Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull.
Welcome to the Rockonteurs.
Okay, guys, I'm ready.
This was great, guys. It's so great to talk to two guys that have done this.
Well, it's a big tune for sure. I actually wrote that originally for Tina Turner.
Of course, I had gone and found Joni Mitchell down in Florida and brought her back.
What people forget about Bowie is that he was such a kind man.
I've listened to a few of them and they've been really good, man. I'm sitting in the back of the car coming into London. They're brilliant.
Remember me? I'm in a band now. It's called Roxy Music.
You know this thing about the 10,000 hours of experience?
Oh, yeah.
Get good at something. When we recorded Arnold Lane, we'd done about 50 hours.
The Rockonteurs podcast with Gary Kemp and Guy Pratt.
It's very, very unnerving seeing people with their guitars and instruments in the background. All you can see of my background is a spare room at the top floor of a house where no one can hear
But
us.
that might be your flute cupboard.
Well, it could be. In fact, I do have my flute with me because I was doing a little bit of preparation yesterday to prepare myself for tomorrow's full rehearsal.
Well, if you feel like blasting a few licks, then there you go.
It's 3 floors away from us. And I'm too old to manage, 6 flights of stairs.
When you say your flute, does that mean, do you have sort of the flute, or are you a man of many flutes?
Well, I suppose I'm a man of many flutes in the sense that I do technically own quite a few of them. But, unlike my old friend James Galway, the man with the golden flute, I'm the man with the second-hand flute. Well, originally kind of the lowest form of student model flutes. But these days I just play a silver flute that is a concert flute of not such huge cost that it's going to break my heart or my pocket if it gets nicked in a parking lot or in a busy suburb of some European country when I'm in search of the worst Indian restaurant in town. They mug me for my flute. I shall cheerfully say goodbye and go to the nearest music store and buy another one. I
want to get to the Indian restaurant thing, by the way, at some point. That's something that I saw in an old interview, which does interest me. But do you not have sort of flute companies, whoever they are these days, I don't know, Boozy and Hawks, sort of offering you great signature Ian Anderson vessels?
Well, therein lies the truth. If I was a humble bass player, such as yourself, or a guitarist, then I would be probably able to get freebies left, right, and centre. But no, flute. The top end of the flute market, nobody gets free flutes. I mean, James Galway proudly says, and I have no reason to disbelieve him, that he has paid in full the full list price for the $40,000-$50,000 flutes that he plays. And I think in a sense, it's a bit of a badge of honor that you pay for instruments that are not being mass manufactured, they're being handmade, and that those people or companies can't afford to give them away. So they're very happy to have that endorsement. And you might just jump the queue if you had to have your flute repadded or polished up nicely for the next gig. But otherwise, no, I think we will pay in full for our instruments.
Because this is what's extraordinary, right? So I'm 13 years old, and the guitar is the weapon of choice for most rock bands, and it's what's turning me on as a kid. But suddenly I'm getting into what you're doing, and the flute. I mean, there was nobody out there. There was no one else that was doing anything comparable, but you somehow made it the weapon of your choice, didn't you? And it became a kind of baton that you led the band with, as well as attacked the audience with at times, and then played some of the most beautiful things I've ever heard.
Ah, well, that came late in the sentence. I thought you were finding a roundabout way of saying I waved the damn thing around in order to avoid showing how bad I was at playing it, which is partly the truth. I wasn't alone, so I don't want to take the credit of being the originator of the flute in rock music, but I guess I became the best known one fairly quickly. But when I started playing, Ray Thomas of the Moody Blues played the flute. Chris Wood of Traffic played the flute. And of course, there was a legion of jazz musicians, not rock musicians, but jazz musicians for whom the flute was a second instrument, really, because they were tenor sax players. And therefore, it was the same fingering, more or less. And so it was a second instrument. And then occasionally people like Roland Kirk pushed it to the fore rather more than others, and made an excellent album, which I think I've been playing the flute for about 2 months. I think we probably on our third or fourth show at the Marquee Club when an old friend came to the gig and showed me or told me of an album he just bought by Roland Kirk called I Talk with the Spirits. And he said, you got to come and listen to this because he sounds just like you. Well, of course, that was a polite thing to say because everybody else thought, well, I sound like him, which was, perhaps coincidence in the first place. But when I listened to the album, I picked up on a tune called Serenade to a Cuckoo, which I introduced fairly quickly into our early shows at the Marquee Club and other places, and it became a bit of a party piece. So that clinched the Roland Kirk relationship. But the whole thing of singing and playing at the same time, it's legions old. I used to do that when I played guitar, at the age of 17. I used to sing along with playing, simple blues guitar solos. And I can remember even playing a tin whistle and sort of humming along at the same time as blowing it. It was scat singing, pianists did it. And saxophone players growled into their instrument when they played. So it's an age-old technique. Roland was just the guy who made it something of an art form.
He used to do things like do political statements, didn't he? And
he was an angry man. Yeah,
didn't he play two saxes at once? Was that him?
Well, actually, he went as far as playing three.
Three, that's right. Yeah,
yeah. It's quite a mouthful, and he was an angry man. And in fact, we played together. I think one of the very first shows we did in the USA in 1969 was the Newport Jazz Festival.
Wow.
I don't know why they invited us because we were just a fairly embryonic blues band, but we were invited to the jazz festival. And then I was appalled when our manager came over and said, "Oh, Roland Kirk's backstage. He wants to meet you." And because I'd heard stories of Roland Kirk being a very angry, just a person who really didn't like people of a certain background or age or whatever. He was an angry man. So I was pretty nervous about it, but he was actually sweetness and light. He was very, very polite and very grateful that I'd actually recorded at that point on our first album his song. And he was, far from being scathing or whatever. I think he recognized that, hey, I'm getting paid the royalties. And to this day, his second wife still picks up a royalty check twice a year and is incredibly grateful for a little bit of pin money, which comes from there.
I suppose when you started out, the first sort of version of your band, which was, had a much more of a basic blues, American blues feel to it, the flute was a bit of a giveaway as to which way you wanted the band to go. This is a much more of a British sounding instrument, isn't it? And because I know that, your sound changed quite drastically after that first album.
The flute wasn't exactly a popular choice, either with one of our managers, Chris Wright at Chrysalis Records, as it became a year later. He thought the flute had no place in a blues band, and I should perhaps learn to play, as he put it, a little rhythm keyboards and stand at the back and let Mick Abrahams, a guitar player, be the front man and do the singing. So, I said, well, that's very interesting, Chris. And let me think about it. I'll get back to you on that one. But, and then I think it was Mike Vernon from Blue Horizon Records came along to see Jethro Tull, and I think he felt the same way. It's a band with a flute in it. And I think he said, it'll never happen in a million years. It was one of those typical quotes of record company guys. I had to be a little bit thick-skinned and self-confident about trying to find a place for the instrument, really, in the context of what we were doing. But it was the audience who clearly made that decision so much easier, because they were beginning to respond to the fact that we weren't just like all the other blues bands. We weren't Chicken Shack or Savoy Brown or Fleetwood Mac or any of those guys. It didn't have a point of difference in the way that Jethro Tull did, because we were different. And the flute was the instrument that made it different. And I suppose the little bit of irreverent humor and the not taking ourselves too seriously maybe engendered a bit of positive support from audiences. We didn't make it look as if we were the best musicians in the world, which of course we couldn't be, because every second Wednesday, yes, we're on at the Marquee Club, and you're called The Nice.
The Nice.
Back in those days, it was Keith Emerson. So there were plenty of bands, or King Crimson, goodness me, very, very good musicians, if maybe a little noodly in terms of their obsession with, cramming a lot of notes into a lot of short bars. But Jethro Tull kind of clicked, I think, with an audience, because we weren't too complicated. That came later.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say. I mean, obviously, Mick Abrahams wanted to stay as a blues-based artist. There was something in your soul that you've got Celtic background, and your father's from Scotland, and that must have felt more true to you, to have a more British feel. There are also these other bands going on which Joe Boyd has nurtured, the incredible string band, the Fairport situation. There's some folk in the air. It's more credible now, isn't it? Were you plugged into that?
Well, I wasn't really, but I think by 1968 I began to realize from people like Bert Jansch and Roy Harper in particular that there was an element of music that I knew little about, but it rang a few distant bells of my childhood growing up in Scotland, because Scottish folk music was not too far away. And I had a bit of a twitch in my sporran, a bit of something I needed to scratch. And it was, in a way, soothed by incorporating some elements of British music and then European music, because when I began to look at the bigger picture of other ethnic forms of music in different parts of the world, but particularly in Europe, folk music and, of course, classical music, then all of this became a heady mix. Probably too many influences for one man to cope with, but that's what I've made a living out of doing for most of my life. And I think drawing upon these sometimes quite disparate sources of musical inspiration is a good thing, but you've got to be very careful not to just make it a pastiche. It's easy to be in the musical kitchen, and as a chef, you think, oh, I'll have a bit of that, pour some of that in, or some of this, stir it all up. It ends up being an unholy mess. Probably one of the reasons people won't eat anything I cook. I made my wife some absolutely authentic New England clam chowder soup, and she wouldn't eat it because she loves clam chowder soup. But because I made it, she assumes it's got some weird stuff in there that she wouldn't like clams, perhaps.
Because your first album was done, you did it at Sound Techniques studio, didn't you?
Yeah.
Because that's where all that folk stuff was happening, wasn't it? That's where Fairport and everyone was working.
Yeah. If you mean by that it was cheap, then yes, it was. And that was primarily the reason that we went to Sound Techniques. Yeah. It wasn't because we knew anything about the studio or the people who worked there or had recorded there. It was simply that our managers, because we couldn't get a record deal, so they decided to borrow some money and from a bank, from the National Westminster in Milton Keynes, like £1,000 or something, and we made the album. And then they tried to find someone who would take it on and release it, which luckily Chris Blackwell of Island Records decided to do. Then in the USA, we got a deal with Reprise Records, which was a division of Warner's, but actually Reprise was set up for Frank Sinatra. And that's where we kind of kicked off really worldwide. So it was good, but it was where I learned to hands-on, to sort of find out how the recording process worked and the various technical elements that were in place back then.
If you go down to one of the record stores, the vinyl stores near where I am in Soho, that have got all the rare stuff, on the wall, there's always this copy of This Was, and it's always the most expensive album you can buy. I mean, it beats the Beatles, it beats everything. If you get that island pressing, I only have the measly chrysalis version. That is still the most sought after piece of vinyl I think there is in the country.
Well, it was a little bit of an odd one because when it came to coming up with an album cover, I again made myself very unpopular, not only with our managers and record companies, but also with the record stores, because they didn't like the idea of an album cover that had a picture of a bunch of old men with lots of mysterious dogs and had no text. It didn't say Jethro Tull or the name of the album. It was just that was the front cover. The rear cover, I agreed we would put the name on. So on the rear cover, it does show another picture, which was taken, a photograph by Brian Ward, I think, one of the publicity photographs we did in the very early days. And for some reason, I had a cutout fish. I think part of the reason these things worked, it was a little surreal. When I was at art college for a couple of years, like many British contemporaries who became musicians rather than following a painterly trade, I guess we were all a little enraptured by the surrealist movement, particularly Magritte.
Thus the pipe. Is that why you took on smoking the pipe, Ian? That wasn't Magritte's influence, was it?
Well, it wasn't. That was actually because our maths teacher, Granny Jones, actually encouraged me and John Evans and Jeffrey Hammond to pursue, as a hobby, to pursue music. And our parents wouldn't sign for any hire purchase agreement for us to buy instruments, and Granny secretly did. He put his professional reputation and I suppose first his loyalty to his students on the line by signing the agreement, so he was actually liable if we damaged or ran off with the equipment. And we all rather revered him because he was a calm, quiet, just looked like an absolute stereotypical maths teacher, and smoked a pipe. St. Bruno was his brand. And so John Evans and I aspired to become pipe smokers and choked to death very nearly with St. Bruno flake. Anyway, yes, that was the beginning of the pipe smoking. But then it did set Jethro Tull a little bit aside because at one point, particularly around 72, 73, 74, there were 3 pipe smoking members of the band. And when it later cropped up in the form of Spinal Tap's bass player.
Oh, of course.
Has the Peterson pipe. And I actually interviewed him live on stage in a kind of a talk show, musical show that I was doing in America. He brought his bass. We did the whole Spinal Tap spoof thing, but I was interviewing it and sat him down on the sofa and said, Harry, the one thing I really have always wondered is that your character in Spinal Tap, has a rather odd name. And I just wondered if how you came to pick on that name. Was it inspired by something else? And he said, not really, no, it's just something that, thought up. We're always thinking up kind of crazy ideas. And I said, well, that's really interesting. May I just ask, did you ever have a copy of, ever see the album Thick as a Brick or A Passion Play? And he said, oh, well, and this is in true Bill Clinton fashion. Oh, well, I might have had a copy, but I never listened to it. And because, of course, his character's name was the same as one of the characters, both on Thick as a Brick and on A Passion Play.
I think it's Derek Small.
Derek Smalls. Yes. In my version, it was just Derek Small. But in Harry's version of Derek Smalls, plural. And I actually produced a copy of Thick as a Brick and read it out to him, The audience were all laughing and Harry was getting a little uncomfortable. And then I said, and the other thing, what odd thing for anybody in a rock band to be smoking a Peterson pipe, And he said, yeah, well, another one of those things I thought up. And I showed him another picture of 3 members of Jethro Tull posing with Peterson pipes. So I really had him there. It was a glorious moment.
There's so much to talk about with you. Because the other thing is Terry Ellis, your manager, he is, and if you look at old footage of Terry talking, he's the manager from Spinal Tap, isn't he? I mean,
absolutely.
That was based on him.
Here's the truth behind that. One of Terry's employees in the management company called Friday Management, this guy who was around for 2 or 3 years and traveled with Jethro Tull as the kind of tour manager, kind of senior person. He then left, I think, to become the manager of a band called Styx, and became a consultant, so we're told, to Rob Reiner in the making of the movie. So they probably had a lot of brainstorming sessions and lots of little scenarios that everybody who watches Spinal Tap, or at least any of my peer group who watch Spinal Tap, looks at it and says, hey, that's about us. That happened to us. And in some cases, they're probably right, with the Stonehenge gag, for instance. I mean, that clearly was based on a bit of reality. But in other cases, we've all got lost in the bowels of some enormous dome in the USA. We can hear the opening music playing, and we've gone round and come back to the same place again, and we actually can't find how the hell to get from the subterranean walkways into the backstage. It's happened to all of us, I'm sure, but I will have nothing to do with admitting to having a banana down the front of my trousers at airport security.
Let's just go back to that first album, Ian. What this showed me as a young man, and what this was, evidence of for you for the rest of your performing career and still going, is the theatricality of what you do. Guy and I were watching a very old documentary from 1969 about Jethro Tull just yesterday,
dubbed in German,
and you already had your theatrical element. It was kind of comic. It was heightened. It was like no one else that was around at that time. I mean, if you look at Peter Gabriel, he looks like a shy beast on stage compared to you. You could have been an actor, that's for certain. I mean, what you're doing is like Lear's Fool at times. Where did it all come from, that? And when did it arrive? Because this is an early documentary. You've got it already nailed.
I think all of that began because, like so many people who take to the stage, we are very shy people. We're actually uncomfortable in social gatherings. We're nervous. We don't know how to express ourselves. We find a way through via music or becoming a trained thespian. But we're actually overcoming fears and insecurities. And that was very much the case for me. I mean, I was terrified to talk in public, terrified to sing in front of anybody. I was terrified to get on a stage and have people look at me. And after that initial hurdle of actually getting out there and playing in front of about 30 Roman Catholic schoolgirls at the Holy Family Youth Club in the North Shore of Blackpool at the age of 17, perhaps, maybe just 18, suddenly I realized, well, I can hide behind this mask of confidence and musical bravado. And so it's just something that every night on stage, you add a little bit to it. You find what works and what doesn't work. And that's all that it was. It was just really just trying to overcome, the fear and insecurity. And I think to a degree, that's probably what still happens today, because I am Kipling's cat who walked by himself. I'm not a friendly guy. Trying to be polite if people ask me for an autograph or do whatever most of the time. But, I don't have a circle of friends other than the band and the crew and a close family. I don't really enjoy social gatherings at all. I mean, I hate to eat in company. I eat alone. The restaurant thing, the worst Indian restaurant in town, which is where I go, because there's nobody else eating there. So I eat alone in restaurants at lunchtime. And then after the show, I take something back and eat it in my hotel room because I just don't want to be... I'm just not comfortable being with a lot of people. Never have been.
One little thing, it's a tiny little aside, but you were on the Rock and Roll Circus.
We were.
I mean, isn't that amazing? That was an elite thing,
We were asked to do it, I don't think by Mick Jagger or by the director, Michael Lindsay Hogg. I don't think they knew who Jethro Tull was, but rumour was, or more than rumour, it was Bill Wyman And Charlie Watt, I think, had perhaps dropped into the Marquee Club and seen Jethro Tull, and they put us forward to be on the show, which was great, except that we didn't have a guitar player at the time. And
That's
so
right, yeah.
Hence the story of a frantic call to Tony Iommi to say, Tony, are you doing anything on Friday and Saturday and Sunday? And he jumped on a train or did whatever he did and came down and pretended to play the guitar because the backing track was
I didn't realize
he's not really playing. Well, in fact, I was live, but the other guys were just miming. We couldn't do the thing live, which was really humiliating and embarrassing. And of course, the Who were very live, and the Rolling Stones were trying to regather their performance level again, having been off the road and making albums, and Brian Jones wasn't in great shape, so they were struggling. Hence, they weren't very happy, or Mick Jagger, it is said, wasn't very happy with the final program, and so it was unreleased for many years.
Well, I thought it was more to do with the Who's sheer magnificence on it.
Well, that's what people said, that they were upstaged by the Who. I mean, in fact, the Stones were actually pretty good. Jagger was great. He was really driving the whole thing. The other guys were a bit like me. I think they felt a bit embarrassed about it all, and some crazy idea conjured up by Mick and the director. But, I think the end result wasn't so bad if you can discount the moments when Yoko Ono takes to the stage and starts howling and screaming. And I think she came out of a bag or something, didn't she? I mean, we were all just going, oh, no.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
I thought you played a good role in it, in this sort of pageant feel, this very British feel, this circus, medieval, can I use that word? You kind of fitted that perfectly, didn't you? That thing that was going on in Britain.
Beggar's Banquet, it was very much that vibe.
That was a great album. And one of the reasons that I found it as an observer, because we only had a very small part to play in it, having to stay there for the full 2 days of rehearsal and then the recording day, we, being an observer, a fly on the wall, watching all of this take place was really quite a place to be. In the same way as being at the Isle of Wight Festival a year later was, you were there. And the fact that you had a bit of, half an hour of hard work to do, the rest of it, you could just sit and watch other people. And it was extraordinarily enlightening as to the machinations and the complications of either making a television show or running what turned out to be a disastrous festival, but still one that is writ large in the annals of British festival entertainment. And, hey, I was there. I was on that stage, apologizing to the audience for waking them up at 10 o'clock in the morning because we insisted on doing a sound check.
In that documentary we watched yesterday from I think it's 69. So
it's 69.
Is it Stand Up, the album? Bure. Is it Bure? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Bure. Yeah.
I mean, your performance of that on that film is incredible. And you're already introducing Bach into your music. I mean, this is the sort of, dare I use the word, beginning of prog in a way, isn't it?
No, I think that the beginning of prog is probably more 1972, but progressive rock, if we give it its rather less challenging title, controversial title, despised title, progressive rock began in 1969 to be recognized, because I remember reading for the first time in the British music press this term progressive rock, and it mentioned alongside a few bands Jethro Tull, and I thought, yeah, that's what we are. I'll have a bit of that. Progressive rock. Yeah, I like that idea. But when you look back just a couple of years further, progressive rock really began, for me, with Pink Floyd, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. That was the what? That was the movement into something progressive, and again, quite surrealistic at the time, with particularly with Syd Barrett's lyric writing. And in a way, progressive pop began 3 months earlier with Sgt. Pepper. So I think we'd already had big signposts there on the horizon saying, this way, Jethro. So this is perhaps what to aspire to. And
well, I suppose you had things like Whiter Shade of Pale, which is essentially a Bach sequence, isn't it? And then I suppose sort of things like Source.
We certainly were noticing that kind of thing, and the use of classical music motifs in pop music was not unknown.
Ian, I think, what's becoming sort of obvious is how private, in many ways, you prefer to be. I mean, there's an extraordinary moment in that 69 documentary, stepping into this world of mad rock music and being in a band. And you have this interview in that documentary, and you say, you know, I'm not into this mad free love stuff, you know, I'm not into the drug stuff, you know, and I could see that felt like it was coming out of a loyalty for your background. Okay, I'm pushing forward now to ask the kind of question that I want to ask about you as a writer and being in a band. So, because there's the contradiction. You sit at home alone writing your songs. You wrote solo most of the greatest stuff that Jethro Tull ever did. You then have to be in a band and present it to the band. It isn't solo. How does that always feel for you? Because I know as a writer, that was one of my most uncomfortable moments, saying, this is my music.
I was always embarrassed with the band to present any of my ideas in a form where they would hear the lyrics, that I would actually sing anything. We would just rehearse backing tracks. It was kind of safer. So they would very often not know anything about the final form of the music, because if I did have any lyrics written down, I wasn't going to show them because I was too embarrassed. I was usually too embarrassed to sing anything in the studio when there were any people around. So when I did vocals, it would always be just the engineer and I would work alone in the studio, and no hangers on, no band members or managers or whatever. So, you know, I was always very embarrassed, and it was quite tricky, but I began over the years to evolve a better way of doing it. And the way things work today with the last few albums is I write the lyrics, everything, you know, obviously on a computer, it's all meticulously presented and with all the basic chords of the music, and I make little demos in which I sort of sing them, whether it's in a hotel room or somewhere in my house, just sort of singing quietly, just to acoustic guitar and add a bit of flute in. But I actually do the thing now in a way where I really do present the idea. So I want them to understand what the song is about. I want them to understand the lyrics, because I know from playing on other people's records, if I don't know what the song is about, I find it very difficult to come up with what I hope is a sympathetic addition, usually on the flute. And so I have to say, would you mind sending me the lyrics? I can't quite, you know, make it all out. And I think it's very important to try and understand from the writer's point of view what this song is about.
I think what I was also noticing in your lyrics generally, and this goes back to you being a private person, is unlike so many people out there writing songs who want to dig into their soul and expose their emotions and talk about the me and the I, you know, in a way that's, you know, maybe a little cliche, but tends to be about love, if you like, or hurt and pain. You're the narrator in a lot of your songs. You're the storyteller. You know, someone like Aqualung comes into your mind, you know, this tramp, and you want to tell us about that. So, okay, maybe you're not the guy who's going to open up and do that, but you're doing something much more original and different and exciting for us. Where did Aqualung begin for you? That's an incredible thing to want to sing about, isn't it?
The heart on sleeve songs I have a great admiration for when they're beautifully done. People are unveiling their inner feelings and talking about themselves. It's just something that I don't think I'm very good at doing that. It's not that I never do it, but I hardly ever do it. Mostly I'm an observer, but I think that comes from the painterly obsession as a teenager that I wanted to paint pictures, showing people, showing a landscape. I wasn't so much interested in pure landscape, and I wasn't so much interested in head and shoulder portraiture. I like the idea of people in a landscape, almost like actors populating a stage set, that they're in a context. They make us want to know more about them. We may not get the full picture. We may be left waiting for Godot.
There's something quite Beckett about Aqualung.
Yeah, well, maybe there is, but I think it is about this observational thing, and you create something that you have seen, for me, always in a visual sense. I always, not always, but nearly always start with a picture in my head. You know, it could be a photograph, could be a painting, it could be something I watched on CNN, but it comes from a visual source. That's sort of obvious because I studied painting and photography. Then I translate that into music, and then I find that is the way in which there is an immediacy about it and a way of interpreting a picture, but not necessarily always giving every little detail and making it just a true observational piece. I think you've got to have a little mystery in there to make it enticing. Right? I think there are other observational writers around, and I suppose one that springs to mind is Bruce Springsteen. I'm not really a Springsteen fan, but when I hear him singing, I see New Jersey. I see the shoreline. I see the bars. I see the.
Well, it's a way of mythologizing actually very dull places.
Yeah, and
we will meet neath that giant Exxon sign that brings this fair city light. It's a gas station.
Yeah, but it has the ring of truth and authenticity because it's where he grew up, and that's why it seems to have that simple magnificence about it as objective storytelling. Kind of lyric writing.
Aqualung, was this a real guy? This a real person?
Well, it was a photograph taken of particularly this one person living down and out under the archways of some railway in South London somewhere. And it was just something that looked to me like, hey, that's an interesting subject. And just having a photograph to work with, you didn't really know how he sounded, what he looked like, how he talked. It was a photograph taken by my first wife in a very brief marriage when she was studying photography and went off on some assignment to shoot homeless people in South London. I mean, I think Robin Williams depicted a very Aqualung-like character in a movie where he played. I mean, it's quite uncanny because he really does. I often wonder, did he ever see the Aqualung album cover or know of it? Because that is his character. And I think in some of the scenes there where he's living down and out, it had all those elements about it. But the song wasn't, it was one of the two occasions I think in my life I sat down with somebody to write lyrics together. Obviously, it was a bit of a success, and some of the lines, were not written by me for sure. Snot running down his nose is not one of my lines.
Who did you co-write it with?
With my first wife. But and sure, she's credited on the cover as she was.
It is a massive album right now. This song, really, it just breaks you in America as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, and it's interesting because it's one of the very few big Jethro Tull songs that don't have a flute in it. People often imagine it. Oh, there must be a flute in there somewhere. Well, there isn't. Locomotive Breath is a flute. My God, there's a flute. There's plenty of other material of that album that has flute on it, but no, this one doesn't. But it is a sort of singer-songwriter kind of an album, really, Aqualung in its way. It has some big rock songs. It also has these rather more varied kind of songs that you do sitting in some Holiday Inn motel in the Midwest of America with a beaten up old Martin guitar in my hand, strumming a few chords and putting things together. That's how I wrote songs. I hardly ever wrote songs at home. It was always on tour, and I always had a guitar with me.
The cover is a depiction of you as Aqualung, isn't it?
Well, it's not supposed to be, but, secretly, Terry Ellis and the painter, because the painter took photographs of the band in rehearsal in London. He was a New York-based artist that Terry had seen, I think, because he did something in Time magazine. I think he'd been featured. And so Terry got in touch with this guy and asked him to fly over to the UK and, to do an album cover. And, I remember him coming into rehearsal. I remember we all posed for photographs so that he could illustrate the album cover. But one thing I'd made very clear, this Aqualung character is not me. This is a song about a real person who I gave a nickname to in the song. But it's not me, so please don't make me the character. But it ended up kind of looking like me. Well, I used to have the big overcoat, and I used to kind of be a bit hunched and sort of look a bit manic and weird, in the very first shows we did at the Marquee. And in fact, if you look back at the early Sex Pistols, Johnny Rotten is doing an Ian Anderson.
Yeah, that's true. The wide eye thing is great. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, Johnny Rotten, many years later, admitted that Aqualung was for him a seminal album, at least that particular track. And I think he borrowed something from that sort of hunched, rather, it's a mixture of fear and aggression the character has.
What it does as well is it suddenly makes you Jethro Tull to an American kid who's picking up that album. He sees you're doing something really clever here. You're embodying the character you're singing about theatrically. So the audience is seeing one and the same, but it's separating you slightly from the band as well. This is why there was a confusion. They thought you must be this guy called Jethro Tull, right?
Which one's Jethro? Yeah.
But in a way, that is kind of where you're going, isn't it, Ian? Because you're going into, and this, this is not a criticism by any means, because I think this is all why you've been so successful in your life. The band changes its lineup a lot. It's become your band more than anything else, and the other guys could really change at any time.
Yeah, I'm in a band where they can't, unlike you, just say, let's get rid of the singer. It's just one of those situations where I suppose from the earliest day, because I was writing all the music, I was producing the albums after the first couple. And so it was a situation really where I suppose I was any character or personality discrepancies between us. Unfortunately, it always meant the other guy had to walk. And of course I feel, as anybody would, there's always a sense of regret and embarrassment that these things come about, but they do. You can't expect people to remain together for life. As football teams change their centre forward or whatever they call them these days, every few months everybody changes, including the manager. So why on earth should we expect rock and roll bands to stay together for life? We're human beings. Some of us, in fact, most of the members of Jethro Tull have moved on. They weren't fired. There's only actually probably come to mind maybe 3 or 4 that were asked to leave, or whose relationship, contractually was not renewed, to put it that way. But in most cases, it was, hey, it's been great, had a good time, but, I want to do my own thing now and write my own songs, or leave music altogether in the case of 2 or 3 of them. Mm-hmm. They'd had a great time and still think of it very fondly, but they didn't want to go on being musicians. They had other things that they wanted to do in their lives. And that's all quite normal and healthy.
But it's a very clever name as well, because it is a guy's name. It's an extraordinary name. It's a piece of history.
Yeah, again, not my invention.
Which you didn't know, did you?
It's you with the flute standing on one leg. That's the sort of logo of the band.
Yeah. I didn't think up the name Jethro Tull. When our booker in the office in London, when we first started, I think we arrived in London still being called the John Evan Band from Blackpool.
That's the winner.
If only you'd stuck with that.
And then it was supposed to be Ian Anderson's Bag of Blues, but somebody misprinted it and it became Ian Henderson's Bag of Blues.
Well, we're on this spelling. Wasn't it true that your first single, the 7-inch that came out, by Jethro Tull?
We're not sure whether it was a typo or whether it was a very careful attempt to release a song that we'd recorded as a demo for MGM with a producer by the name of Derek Lawrence. After Jethro Tull had become sort of beginning to get noticed and pick up activity at the Marquee Club, and he released it under the name Jethro Tull because we had no contract with him. And clearly there would have been a bit of a furore if he'd released it as Jethro Tull, but he kind of got away with it. And I think it probably sold about 5.5 copies,
This is so wonderful, but we have to talk about Thick as a Brick at some point. We've got to get there. And where to begin on this?
Because the odd thing about Thick as a Brick, and I have to tell you this, Ian, I felt later on in life disappointed when I read that it was a spoof concept album, because I thought, I really thought it was a concept album. Isn't it both?
Well, it is exactly that.
Yes,
it is a concept album, but it's through the preposterous notion that an 8-year-old boy has written these rather bombastic, complicated lyrics. It was formed in many cases by the childhood circumstances of growing up post-war in my era in the 50s and 60s, when children's comics were full of references to Jerry, obviously meaning the Germans.
Yeah.
And they were full of, absolutely politically incorrect notions and
Dollar
statements.
and Blitzen, Gott im Himmel.
We grew up with all that stuff. And I think we learned along the way not to take it to heart, just in the same way as we read Rudyard Kipling. You would be making allowances, surely, for the fact that this was an era, part of colonial Britain. And there are slip-ups there that you think, oh, my God, that is so awful that he said that. But I think you've still got to accept the bigger part of it. You've got to do the same thing if you read the Holy Bible. There's a lot of stuff in there that is deeply unpleasant in terms of
you think
modern social mores and with Thick as a Brick, the point was it was a child presenting his slightly distorted view of the world and being precocious beyond his years, but talking on a meandering array of subjects. And of course, it is a spoof of the concept album as it was becoming known then as prog rock. And it attempts, sometimes not too convincingly, a little bit more of instrumental expertise in terms of arrangements and time signatures and complicated issues. But it was the right album at the right time. The record company had kittens when they heard this, and particularly when I delivered the album cover. But no, you can't do that. I said, yes, we can, because some of the album covers were mine. I was the daddy.
Martin, was it Martin who said you actually spent more time on the cover than you did on the album?
Well, I claim that. Yeah, I think it took 3 weeks. 3 weeks to do the album cover, and 2 weeks to record the album.
Because especially with how long albums were taking at that point, because this is an incredibly complex piece of work. But the fact you did it so quickly. The
way that it worked is I started writing the album. I think the very first opening lines, really don't mind if you sit this one out, which is a great way to start a record.
Yeah, brilliant.
It's giving 2 fingers to the person who just forked out the last few shillings from his.
Yeah, it's the opposite of "Are you sitting comfortably?" Then,
it began that opening little line, this little motif around an F chord, played as it with a capo on the 3rd fret to make it easier for my fumbling fingers. I just had this. Really don't mind if you sit this one out, and I thought, that'll do. That's a start. And then when I got back to England, I then just extrapolated from that notion. And then what I would do is I would write the next 3 or 4 minutes of music in the morning, because I tend to be a morning guy, wake up usually pretty early. And then I would go to meet the other guys at the Rolling Stones rehearsals room, which was a basement, horrible, damp, nasty place somewhere in Bermondsey in South London. And then I would try to impart that I'd written in the morning to the rest of the band, and we would rehearse it, and then the next day the same thing again. We'd join it onto what we'd done the day before until we built up the whole album. Really, just it was being done very much in real time. You know, writing, rehearsing, recording, writing, rehearsing, recording. And when we went into the studio, it was we could have played through like we did on stage. We knew how to do it.
The intricate sort of the scales and the whatever's going on instrumentally in the keyboards and the guitars, is that something you would bring in as well, or is that something that the band would extrapolate?
It would depend. I mean, quite a lot of the lines, there's some sort of 5/4 instrumental line, and that's something that, I'm sure that was something I wrote, and they had to learn to play that. It's only one more than 4/4, and anyone can handle that. Some of the music was a little more complex, but it's true to say that on Thick as a Brick, on Songs from the Wood, and some other records, the band members have come up with elements and interpretations of the music, come up with their own. I mean, Glenn Cornick, I think, came up with the bass line of Living in the Past. Bum, 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 bum.
Brilliant.
I didn't write that. That's the bass player's line. It's very, very difficult, especially after the fact, to say who wrote what. And what I tried to do, I remember in Songs from the Wood, for example, I was then making meticulous notes from this bit to that bit. Somebody else wrote that line. It wasn't me. So there would be maybe 28 seconds of instrumental music that I didn't write. And so that would be duly noted. And then to this day, obviously the mechanical royalties are divided pro rata to whoever came up with some particular lines of music that were strong enough that they would be part of the song as opposed to just some accompaniment. But, somebody comes up with no offense to bass players, but if you've got 4 strings, and I mean, I played a lot of bass on our records, and
yes, you did.
But I only ever used 2 of them. So if I come up with something clever on the bass, I'm think that's just the bass part.
We know our place, but there's a great bass line, and there's a great bass line that is the song. I mean, they're 2 very different things. Just because.
And you mentioned earlier, you mentioned Procol Harum's Whiter Shade of Pale, and many years later there was a huge dispute between Gary Brooker and Matthew Fisher, who was excluded from the songwriting, and yet quite a bit of that tune is the very iconic organ piece, which of course owes more than a little to J.S. Bach. And I know that because I had to play that at one point when I was doing a German TV show. And I had to play, they said, we want you to play the organ line on the flute. And so I said, right, okay. So I learned that. 25 million people watching this on German TV, big spectacular show. I was playing with Gary Brooker and a house band. No one told me that Fisher was there as well. And he was actually playing the organ. So suddenly I'm playing the organ, but playing it on the flute. And I turn around and it's him, the actual guy. He's there playing it too, looking daggers at me because I'm stealing his line, I was asked to do this. I'm sorry. They told me to play it,
I'm interested in this incredible time. You're making complex music. It's got very little to do with rhythm and blues. It's not very American sounding. And yet you are massive in America.
Yeah.
And now, to become massive in America, we've all got to go through some sausage factory and come out the same at the other end. What a time that must have been. And what was it that was why did the Americans eat it up in the way they did?
Because we didn't try too hard. We didn't give a toss whether they liked us or not. The die was cast when Cream went to America. They were the liberators. They had the key to this door. And they went on and just did what they did. As it happened, the audience loved them. And they became huge for a couple of years until they folded. And hot on the heels of that, Led Zeppelin barnstormed into America, having just been the new Yardbirds and then changed their name to Led Zeppelin. And they just looked like they didn't care whether you liked them or not. They didn't care whether there was one person in the audience or 1,000 people or 10,000, wouldn't change the way they played. They didn't care. And Jethro Tull came in and did exactly the same thing. We didn't expect to do well in America, so we didn't care. We just said, this is what we do. We were seeing how this worked on the ground, close up and personal.
But you were very much performing, which is what the Americans love. It's the shoegaze of British bands they don't like.
Well, I know that there've been a great number of, revered artists who really, really wanted to be big in America. And it never really worked out for them. Maybe it worked out, but not on the same scale as it did in the UK or in Europe or in other world territories. And it's left them with a hole in their career. Mm-hmm. The most notable one being dear old Cliff, whose manager, I remember, called me up once. He said, look, can you help? We've been trying this for years and years and years. And Cliff is just so desperate, while he can still do this, he really, really wants to be big in America. And have you got any ideas? Can you suggest how we can break Cliff finally in America? And I, lamely sort of made some noise about, have you tried gospel music, or have you tried this, or, collaboration with other artists or whatever? Oh yeah, we did that. Yeah, we tried that. And I think the short answer, and I had just, on the one occasion I actually met Cliff Richard and we talked about stuff like that, I could see how much it mattered. But, the point being that if you want it so badly, it's probably not going to happen. And if you really just don't care that much, you just sail on through.
Cliff also was, God bless him as well, doing stuff that the Americans have.
Yeah.
We have loads of that.
Yeah, he was our Elvis. I mean, Tommy Steele, who we sort of loved because he was a bit outrageous at the time, but he wasn't. I mean, Cliff was the one who came with the, the sneering lip and the wobbly leg. I mean, it was absolutely, of course, he was modeled on Elvis, or the early Elvis. Cliff didn't really have something to say that was peculiarly British. Some great songs and obviously the Shadows were a great band, but the Americans had already had that with the Ventures and the twangy Fender guitars. So whereas when Zeppelin roared in, I mean, these guys were from outer space. These were swashbuckling Nordic gods.
Forget them. What you were doing as well. I mean, this was the Nordic god. We're talking to him now. I mean, what you were doing on stage was so theatrical and extraordinary. Americans didn't dare do that stuff. And it was a sort of a very British looking culture that you were presenting to them. And I think it was a time when they really wanted to connect with that.
I think that pretty soon Americans did cotton on to the theatricality of the British band, most notably with Alice Cooper, who was probably, along with Jethro Tull, the first acts to do nationwide tours where we actually had a stage set and stuff happened on the stage that wasn't strictly within the pantheon of rock and roll. And then, of course, there were even with Black Sabbath, there was a kind of a bit of a pantomime about all of that too. And I think the Americans picked up on these things. So there were gradually evolved a number of much more theatrically minded American acts, Kiss being another example. Prior to that, Captain Beefheart in 1972, when he beseeched me to be allowed to come and be a support act on a tour, which I tried to talk him out of. But he really wanted it so badly. And I was a big fan of Beefheart, as many of us were back then. He came on and did the tour, and it was very theatrical and very, it fitted perfectly, actually, with Thick as a Brick, which is what we were doing on a couple of US tours back then. And it was very theatrical and surreal. I thought it fitted perfectly. Probably musically did, except the audience hated Captain Beefheart. They hated Captain Beefheart almost as much as they hated Alex Harvey when he toured with us. Very theatrical, brilliant clothes and things. But something about Alex just rubbed them up the wrong way. Something about Don Van Vliet rubbed them up the wrong way. And who knows what it was or why it was, but the audiences just didn't connect. I think the confidence and the slightly pushy nature of Beefheart and of Alex Harvey, the audiences, it was borderline, but then they did things that just turned the audience.
Well, can I suggest that it might have something to do with your ability to be complex, but at the same time intriguing and not, commercial? There's something about your voice that's very unique, and maybe it's got a little bit of that schoolmaster in it that you spoke about earlier with your pipe smoking schoolmaster friend, and some of those other guys you've mentioned, a little bit abrasive.
I mean, happened with Roxy Music. Roxy Music supported us at Madison Square Gardens. I was a big fan of their first album, and I was so pleased that we were going to come do Madison Square Gardens. We had 2 nights, and I mean, they walked on stage and the audience went, you could hear sort of growling, grumbly noises like my kitten makes when he's just brought in a field mouse or a bird or something into the kitchen and you try to take it from her. So there's this sort of noise going on when Roxy Music took to the stage. And then by the end of the first song, the audience had hated them. And it was really so sad because they were actually really, I loved that.
Probably too louche for your audience.
Well, it was, I think, a little bit too dressy, a little bit too fond of themselves, a little preening. I mean, Brian Eno, I mean, frankly, they hated him even more than they hated Brian Ferry.
Yeah.
So, and the only time they got this enormous round of applause was in desperation when it was at the end of their set. Okay, for our last song, we'd like to play our big hit in England called Virginia Plain. And the audience went wild. They were clapping and cheering and jumping up and down. And he thought, oh, finally, we've cracked it with the last song. And you could see they launched into Virginia Plain, giving it all they'd got, thinking, finally, we've cracked America. They'd just failed to register the fact that he'd said, and for our last song, more than anybody, I wanted them to succeed.
Yeah, there is so much to talk about. I don't know. Why didn't you make Thick as a Brick 2 a Jethro Tull album?
In 2011, I think, was when I started working on this. I had kind of an idea for it that I discussed with a number of people, including Derek Schulman, singer of Gentle Giant.
Who now works for a record label.
Well, he did at that point. In fact, he'd sort of semi-retired by then. But he
came up in our John Bon Jovi.
Absolutely, he was a big wig as an A&R man, not a producer, but as a kind of record company exec who spotted and signed new talent.
We should get him on the show.
Yeah, he's a lovely guy. And he was the one who tried to persuade me there should be a Thick as a Brick 2. And I first, of course, I did what I always did and said, no, I can't go back there and revisit that. It was just a one-off thing. I agreed to meet him, and we sort of had a brief lunch somewhere in America. And I was trying to think of all the reasons why it's a bad idea. Either he or I said these words, I wonder what Gerald Bostock, being the name of the fictitious child author of the lyrics, I wonder what Gerald Bostock would be doing today. That was the moment. I thought, that's the album. It's whatever it was, 40 years later. Now we've got a guy who's middle-aged. What would he be today? And that's the concept of the album. So I started writing down a whole list of possibilities, including, US astronaut, movie star, just a list of maybe 10, 12 different occupations where he might have gone on, including having been a total failure in life and, being a down and out and whatever.
Aqualung.
Well, exactly. All those things were part of the potential scenario. I thought, I can't pick one of these because, I can instantly see there's lots of ways to make that work. And so I thought, well, what about if I pick a few of them? If I pick 5 or 6 of these characters and explore the idea of what might have happened if things had turned out that way as opposed to a different way. And it was also slightly brought to life by when he left the White House, George Bush wrote a actually very, very poignant and very good autobiography called Decision Points, which was really about all the points in his life where he could have gone this way, but he went that way. And that defined the next stage of his life. He went all the way through to the invasion of Afghanistan and his relationship with Dick Cheney and so on. It was a very good book, but again, that chimed with this idea of there being along the way little moments where you could take this road or you could take that road. And I look back at my life and I can see several points where that was the case. So I thought that was fertile ground for a concept album, and I have to give Derek credit for part of that idea, because whether it was he or I who said those words, it was, as soon as we said it, whoever did, it was, there we go, that's it, that's what it could be about.
But it was an Ian Anderson solo album, not a...
Well, it began as that, because I thought this is a bit too, that early point of beginning to evolve the idea. It's to call it a Jethro Tull album might be a little bit too, smack too much of being thick as a brick too. And so I thought, I'm going to release this under my own name, but obviously it is alluding to Jethro Tull. But, rather than call it Thick as a Brick 2, it was TAB, TAAB 2, which I tried to just divorce it a little bit from being too, Bat Out of Hell 5 or Rocky 9 or something. So,
and of course, and it wasn't a newspaper, the cover, it was a website, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, that's right. Yes, of course it was. It was an online sort of parochial newspaper, but brought up to date in the present day with the same sort of absurd little silly stories, odd characters. But yes, it was the online version of the Thick as a Brick cover. And it was, it was a lot of fun doing all of that. But I had a feeling that it probably wasn't going to necessarily ring the right kind of bells with the previous members of the band. And so I embarked upon writing it all, and then decided on that uneasy course of making it a solo album that wasn't really a solo album. But I'm quite good at making those. I've done more than one solo album that turned out to be more of a band album.
Yeah, A, wasn't A? The 1981 was called A because it was
A for Anderson.
Anderson, yeah.
Yeah, not A for Anarchy, which all of our Italian fans thought was the reason for the A.
Yeah. And of course, that's just been remixed by Stephen Wilson as well, hasn't it?
He's done a lot. I mean, is it the whole catalogue? I mean, he's done a lot.
No, he started off doing, I think the first one was actually a remix of Aqualung, and his name had come up. I was kind of looking online, and his name came up as having remixed in the court of the Crimson King Crimson. And so he seemed to have the credentials, because I'd heard, not that I never met him, but I'd heard that Robert Fripp was a bit of a tricky guy, very much a control freak, and things had to be done his way. So I thought, well, if he gets on with Stephen Wilson and obviously happy enough to go ahead and do the whole album, then, it's a very good testimony. We tossed a couple of tracks to Stephen and said, just do us a rough mix, and you see how you approach it. And it became very obvious that what Stephen did was not radical so much as following very carefully the original album in terms of, for the most part, the stereo positioning of instruments and the relative balances of instruments. What he did was meticulously go through all the tracks and tidy them up, clean them up, take out all the clicks and the hisses and the extraneous noises, and create a lot more transparency in the music. I was very happy with him proceeding to do the whole album, and then that led on to another one and another one and another one. He, like me, is in the throes at the moment of trying to get back on the road. So it's a 2022 project for him to do what may well be the last one, which is Broadsword and the Beast, which was from 1982. Right. So it'll be the anniversary of that album, to be released next year, for which there are a huge number of tracks, many of which have never been released before, that were demos done around that period of time.
Talking of this, of great things still being with us, right? Which obviously is why we have you on the show. What's your ambitions, Ian? What's your plans for the future? New music, etc.
People of my age probably have 2 or 3 things on a bucket list, so to speak, they'd like to try and get done. And I did a couple of them in the last 2 years during the lockdown period, one being the Jethro Tull biography, which I didn't write, but it was very much, very heavily involved. And then, or effectively, just as the pandemic was beginning, I think was the time when it finally was out there. But at the same time, I started working on a book of all the collected lyrics of, which is 380 pages of whatever, 250 songs or whatever they are. But
I've seen you signing those on your Instagram site.
Yeah, I had to listen to every single thing I'd ever recorded, not once, twice, 3, probably 5 times. It took a lot of listening to everything I'd ever done, which was, in a way, something I thought would be really excruciating, particularly with some of the things that I felt were, I was young then. I'm not going to like it hearing it today. But in fact, I sort of got myself back into that frame of mind when I wrote those songs. And in almost all cases, I began to feel quite good about it. There's 2 or 3 or 5 maybe that I am truly embarrassed about, but most of them are not nearly as bad as I thought they would be. But it did involve really scrutinizing everything. So as a project, it took me, I used to think from beginning to end, at least 6 months working, 2 or 3 or 4 hours a day. It took an enormously long time to get all of that, put it all into the right format, get all the photographs together and all the various attempts to do the final edition of the book. And only to find out that it's now been postponed until at the earliest October this year because of the horrible slowdown in international trade. We did the pre-orders back in the middle of 2020. And so I feel so embarrassed that we're now 2020, we're a year later, basically. People are waiting. They've paid the money, they still haven't got the book. But it is coming. It's just that initially all the, materials, even paper, ink, stuff that's supposed to be going around the world. And this book is actually being physically printed or physically manufactured in China. And so it's been totally messed up by all the world trade, including the Panama Canal blockage, which the Suez Canal, was it? Where was the
Suez?
Yeah, we've got to move that boat. Jethro Tull's lyric books are on it.
It completely messed up international shipping, and so many things. We're still living today, even though the canal's open and everything's going on. There's this huge backlog. I mean, you see it when you go in your local supermarket. There is stuff that you can't get because it's on a boat somewhere. It hasn't been shipped yet because of the huge backlog. So that's the reason I'm being given is international trade, international shipping. Everything is being slowed down at the moment.
Ian, thank you so much for giving us so much time because your stories are fantastic.
Not to be sycophantic because you know this bit out, but just you two guys I know quite well from what you've done, and obviously from the more recent Pink Floyd stuff and Nick Mason stuff, and I loved when I guess it was your early on entry into the Thespian Pursuits when you and your brother did The Craze.
Oh yeah.
Which I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I mean, I couldn't actually believe it. The guys from Spandau. How can they do that?
And could you even more believe that the guys from Spandau Ballet bought Thick as a Brick and Aqualung and loved it as kids?
A lot of odd people have, I have to say. Some people who I think, you must be kidding me. You wouldn't. I would have expected Harry Shearer to have a copy of Thick as a Brick and listen to it. But there are other people who I think, what?
I just want to give you a quick quote because Nick Cave is an old mate of mine. Yeah. And I saw that he was actually such a fan. This surprised me that he got you to present a Mojo Award to him for an album.
That's right.
And because I just texted him last night. And I said, I see you're a Tull fan. And he said, fuck yes, Tull are the best. One of the few Brit prog bands I listen to regularly. Outrageous, politically dubious, obscene. They went places no band has ever gone, let alone having a flute as a principal instrument. Ian Anderson's vocal style was something to behold and a formidable songwriter. I saw them in Melbourne in the mid-70s and they blew my mind.
Wow. And to think that I spent 2 hours yesterday writing a new biography for the new album. All I had to do was wait till you told me this and
I'll send you Nick's text.
You deserve it all, Ian. Thank you so much.
That was an absolute joy.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I've talked far too long and I'm sure you've got better things to do.
No such thing.
Take care.
That was incredibly long and amazing, and we covered very little ground.
I know. I felt, that was hardly any of his career because he's made so many records, hasn't he, as well? And
well, it's never stopped. If you look, it's one of those people. There's no kind of peaks and troughs. It just started, and he's just gone endlessly.
Yeah. I mean, a real honour to talk to him. I mean, such a legend and a unique man. I mean, he's not like, he doesn't follow any of the cliches of rock and roll, does he?
At all, no. And an incredibly articulate and erudite man as well.
Like yourself, like yourself.
Well, I didn't want to say anything. Right. Well, that's all from us then.
Yeah, it's good to be back. We're all firing now, aren't we?
We are all firing.
Coming up next week. The new season is here.
Oh, yes. Oh gosh, my God. Yeah. This is the season premiere.
Yeah.
The Rockonteurs fall season.
Yeah. So we'll be seeing you next week with another great artist. Until then, it's good night from me.
And good night from her.